Chapter 32. Ang was crying in the kitchen and putting all his worldly goods into a carrier bag. "Hi," said James. "Hi," Ang said through his tears. He cried in long, monotonous strings of sound, not unlike his singing. "What's wrong?" said James.
"I's fired,"
he wept.
"To China."
He rolled up his mother's story cloth and tucked it carefully between half a pack of penguin biscuits and his Goal aftershave. "For peanuts?" said James cautiously. Maybe Brian Pigeon had changed his mind and decided to cut Ang in on the whole getting fired thing. But Ang just shook his head and carried on keening. James went to find Brian. It wasn't hard. He was standing under a VW Beetle, shouting at someone on the phone about the old pit and the new lift. James laid out his tools and waited for him to finish. When he had, Brian snapped his phone shut and shouted, "What?"
"Did you fire Ang?"
"No," he yelled. "Jesus Christ!" James ignored the yelling. It was Brian's default. Once you ignored it, it usually went away.
"He thinks you fired him, and he's going back to China."
Brian laughed and waggled his phone. "Well, I might have said I was calling immigration." James pursed his lips. He caught Pavel's eye, and Pavel shrugged, as if it didn't matter to him one way or the other.
"He's packing his stuff,"
said James. "Let him. What a little drama queen."
"He's crying."
"Good," said Brian. "I'm the one who should be crying. He bumped the bloody Alpha." James glanced across the garage at Brian's green Alpha T-Spark. "Shit," he said. Ang's first job every morning was to move the cars out of the garage and onto the forecourt, so there was space to work. But he had to sit on a cushion to see over the dashboard, and James knew he couldn't possibly have passed his test, given that he was an illegal immigrant. And Brian knew those things too, so James's sympathy was not with him, even though this was not the first car Ang had bumped, and was unlikely to be the last.
"Expensive?"
he asked. "Nah," said Brian. "It's a scrape. But I'm not made of bloody money, and Nicole wants to go to Prague for Christmas."
"Very beautiful," said
Pavel. Brian looked at him. "You what?"
"Prague is very beautiful," shrugged Pavel. "But everybody steal."
"Oh, fucking great. Just what I need. More foreigners with their hands in my pockets."
"If it's just a scrape," said James irritably, "why scare the shit out of him over it?"
Brian rounded on him. "Don't you start. This is my garage. And if you don't like the way I run it, you can piss off and find another job, and another place to live, too." James didn't answer him. He just turned and headed back towards the kitchen to explain things to Ang. "Don't you bloody mollycoddle him," yelled Brian. "He's a grown man." Chapter 33. Officially, Marvel was back on the Tansy Anderson case. He'd asked to review the file to bring himself up to speed, and did just that, while he sat in Jimmy the Fix's BMW and watched Robert Clyde's house. It was 3 days before the boy who'd found Mitzi came back for his money. He was a thin white boy with neat brown hair. He was wearing jeans, big white trainers, and a Spurs shirt. Marvel was a West Ham fan, but that wasn't the only reason his suspicions were aroused. The boy looked about 13 or 14, certainly young enough to be accompanied by a parent in the matter of £1,000, if he really had been denied a legitimate reward. But this boy was alone. He went up to the door and knocked on it, and Marvel slid lower in his seat, although he was across a road that was cluttered and narrowed by parked cars. Clyde himself opened the door. Even from here, Marvel could hear Mitzi yapping. The boy and Clyde talked briefly. The boy held out a piece of paper that Marvel assumed was the stopped check. They talked. Clyde smiled and nodded, then replaced the check with what looked like another one. Clyde himself handed it over. Marvel wished he had brought that camera again. It would have served Clyde right. He had promised he'd be very grateful, and he hadn't been. Fair enough, thought Marvel, if he'd done a bad job, but he hadn't. He'd done a good job, even though it wasn't one worth doing, let alone well. Now Marvel couldn't let go of the idea that he'd somehow been cheated out of the gratitude he'd been due, and therefore cheated out of his chance of a promotion. If he had been cheated by this kid, Marvel wanted to know about it. And if there was a chance that he might still derive some advantage from the case of Mitzi Clyde, then Marvel wanted to know about that too. Across the street the boy left, folding the check and putting it in his back pocket as he trotted down the garden steps and carefully closed the gate behind him. Before he turned away, he waved, and Clyde waved back, and then shut the door. Didn't even watch the kid go. Some bloody copper. Marvel waited until the Spurs van got to the end of the street and turned left before he pulled the BMW out of its space and followed him. The boy walked like all kids did nowadays, like a gangster with an A and his underpants showing. That underpants thing never failed to get Marvel riled. The boy passed the police station and went into the kebab shop. 5 minutes later he came out and continued his journey, eating a huge doner, leaning well forward so the shredded lettuce and sauce didn't drop down his nice white Spurs shirt. Marvel hadn't had a kebab for years. The smell of the super's office always put him off. But now he could see the food, he remembered the taste of pungent fat in his cheeks, and his mouth watered. 1,000 quid bought a lot of kebabs. 1,000 quid bought a lot of everything when you were 14. The boy ate quickly, and when he'd finished, he balled up the wrapper, and then held on to it until he got to a litter bin. Surprising. His civic pride belied his underpants. It made Marvel doubly suspicious when people didn't behave the way they should, or at least the way they looked as if they should. He was a firm believer in stereotypes. As far as he was concerned, stereotypes were there for a reason, and trying to ignore them for the purposes of objectivity was political correctness gone mad. He continued the slow-motion pursuit with new interest. There was something about this kid he didn't like. More than just the Spurs shirt and his arse hanging out of his jeans. Marvel's hackles rose even further when the boy slouched through the doors of Marks and Spencer, that bastion of the middle-aged and middle class. Marvel pulled the BMW into a bus stop and hurried across the pavement to follow the boy inside. As his instincts had told him he would, the boy got on the escalator and went up to the second floor. Straight to the cafe. Marvel stood in the queue a few places behind him. He picked up a tray for cover and peered around the cafe's clientele. There were the same well-to-do grey-haired customers, and the same women in their monkey outfits, bustling between tables with trays and tea cakes and toasted sandwiches. There was nobody else in the cafe under the age of 50. Marvel frowned. Had his instincts deserted him? He had been so sure he would see Richard Latham here. He looked down the line behind him, confused. The boy up ahead stood out like a sore thumb. He'd picked up a tray but hadn't put anything on it. Yet. Marvel swore to himself that if the kid bought a pot of tea and sat down and drank it alone, he'd hand in his resignation from the Metropolitan Police Force. It was a close-run thing. The boy got all the way to the till before he ordered something. Then he pulled out a few coins and his green loyalty card and the check. If Marvel hadn't seen him tuck the check away at the super's house, he would never have spotted it now, folded neatly under the card.
The woman behind the till didn't miss a beat. She put the money in the till. She stamped the card. She pocketed the check. The boy picked up his coffee, put it on his tray, and left them both on the table nearest the door on his way out. Marvel was momentarily torn over whether or not to go after him, but quickly decided to stay with the money. He reached the till himself and asked for a coffee. The generic middle-aged woman with the fez was as chatty as a chimp. "Anything to eat with that, sir? Do you have a loyalty card, sir? Do you want one? Every 10 coffees, you get one free." When she opened the till for his change, he looked at her big bosom and read her name tag, Denise. "No thanks, Denise. The tea cake will be fine for now." This was the woman who had come over and made a lame joke about Richard Latham. She'd patted his shoulder. They knew each other. And she had just received £1,000 in reward money for finding a lost dog that Latham had promised would be home soon. Jackpot. When Denise handed Marvel his change, he snapped a handcuff on her wrist and told her she was under arrest for extortion, for starters. She said, "What?" then burst into loud tears while her colleagues rushed over from all corners of the cafe, screeching and chattering their confusion and outrage. Marvel left M&S with Denise trailing reluctantly behind him, feeling like an extremely smug organ grinder. The moment they opened the door to Denise Granger's home, Marvel could smell the dogs. There were 4 of them in a back bedroom, all pedigrees and each in a wire cage, turning circles in its own shit. Marvel thought of Denise giving him his change and wished he could wash his hands. "I knew he was hiding something," Marvel told the super, but Clyde said nothing. One of the cages was empty. "Must have been where she kept Mitzi," Marvel went on. Superintendent Clyde only grunted. Marvel had never seen anybody less happy to get £1,000 back. Eventually he spoke, staring at a miniature schnauzer. "Has she confessed?" "Like the fucking Pope," Marvel said gleefully. He handed Clyde the same flyer that had lured Anna Buck out of the house. "Nice little business. Kid steals the dogs, Granger looks after them. Then they drop church leaflets through a few doors in the area where the dogs were nicked. TV psychic, blah, blah, blah. Depending on what the owner does, they either sell the dog on for cash, or Latham keeps the owner on the hook for a while for donations, and then they collect the reward." "No questions asked." The words hung in the air so loudly that even Marvel didn't think there was any mileage in repeating them. Clyde stared at the dogs for a moment, then said, "I'm Catholic, Chief Inspector," and walked out of the bedroom and down the stairs. Marvel rolled his eyes at his crappy luck and followed him downstairs to the hallway of the small terraced house. Through the open door into the lounge, he could see 3 lanky teenagers crammed together on the sofa, 2 girls and a boy. Despite their mother's arrest, and the police in the house and the stolen dogs upstairs, all he saw in their eyes was the reflection of the TV screen. Clyde spoke without looking at Marvel. "She's implicated Latham by name?" "Yes, sir, and the kid's the grandson of a neighbor. Bloody Spurs fans." He stopped quickly in case the super was a Catholic and a Spurs fan, but if he was, he didn't say so. "So," Marvel counted charges off on his fingers, "we've got theft of property, extortion, misrepresentation, obtaining pecuniary advantage by deception, conspiracy to defraud." He paused, then added, "obstruction of justice." The super gave him a chilly stare. "I'll tell you what you've got, Marvel. 3 defendants, one of them a minor, another one a mother of 3 who works at M&S, and an old man who was once paid £2,000 by this very department to talk to the dead.
Workload, huge. Chance of convictions, maybe 5%. Sentences, a slap on the wrist all round if we're lucky. Publicity, bloody terrible. All over a lost dog that you promised to find quickly and discreetly as a personal fucking favour. The super's voice had increased in intensity, to the point where even the teenagers were staring at him now, like three wise monkeys on a sofa. The one with the remote had even hit mute in order to hear him better. The super glanced round, then leaned into the room and pulled the door shut on them. "You couldn't let it go, could you?" he hissed, "even after I told you." Marvel understood the super's anger. Clyde's transgression was not big, but it was potentially very damaging. Any half-smart lawyer would point out his failure to carry out a proper investigation at any trial, to try to discredit the department. And it was a discredit. At Clyde's rank, at his time of life, a black mark on his record would put the brakes on any further progress he'd hoped to make. "There's still time to stop this," said the super. Marvel hesitated. There was still time, and he knew it. All he had to do was give Denise Granger a caution, scare the kid, give Latham notice to cease and desist, and return the dogs. That would keep Clyde happy, the whole thing out of court, and he'd be on Easy Street, cherry-picking his cases and almost certain of that promotion, whether he deserved it or not. But he'd lose any leverage he'd ever have on Richard Latham regarding the Edie Evans case. Marvel sighed deeply. He'd always rubbed people up the wrong way. He was a throwback whose face didn't fit the new modern police force, peopled by short men with degrees and vegetarian lesbians. He hadn't always made the right friends, said the right things, kissed the right asses. Now Clyde was offering him a chance to change all that, and all he had to do was nothing. He didn't really have a choice. "I'm arresting him," he shrugged. Superintendent Clyde stared at him in disbelief, then glanced at the door to the living room. "This isn't about stolen dogs, and you know it. It's about your obsession with Edie Evans." Marvel couldn't even deny it. "Latham knows more about her than he's told us. If he knew any more, he'd have told you when you were paying him to tell you. Not if he killed her." "What do you mean?" Marvel wasn't sure what he meant. The words had fallen out of his mouth before his brain had even engaged. But now that they were out there, they started to make sense to him. And something, anything, making sense right now felt like a breath of fresh air. He looked over his shoulder at the living room door and lowered his voice. "Look what he did with Mitzi. Kidnapped her and made money off the back of it. Not just reward money, but people coming into the church every week paying for private consultations, making donations to that bloody roof until, lo and behold, the dog is returned just as he said it would be. And all of it stroking his ego, building his reputation as a psychic, earning him money." "So?" Clyde looked unimpressed. "So," said Marvel, "think about Edie Evans. What if he kidnapped her? Only so that he could find her." Clyde blinked in surprise, and Marvel hurried on. "All of a sudden he's on TV, being a big shot. The numbers at the church go into orbit. His ego goes into orbit. All he has to do is waffle about gardens and roll in white wheels for a while, and then lead us to her, and he's got it made. A bigger church, a TV series, books, videos, movies, the lot. After that, he's always going to be the psychic who found Edie Evans." "So what went wrong?" said Clyde. "I don't know, but something. Maybe something beyond his control. Maybe an accident. She fell, she choked." Marvel took a deep breath. "Or maybe he just snapped and killed her." Clyde was silent.
The sound of family fortunes seeped through the living room door, the coarse "uh-oh" of a wrong answer. Marvel said urgently, "But we'll never know if we don't have this to hold over his head. I need him in a room, under pressure, distracted by the immediate threat of prosecution, and with his eye off the bigger ball. Make him slip up on one thing when he's concentrating on hiding the other." "So let me get this right," said Clyde slowly. "You'd throw me under the bus on the off chance of getting some tiny scrap of information you don't even know would be useful. From a psychic?" Marvel said nothing, and Clyde's lips tightened bitterly. "You know, you can arrest 100 people for 1,000 stupid little things, and it will never change the fact that you're the one who failed Edie Evans." Marvel bumped the super's shoulder hard as he brushed past him on his way to the front door. As he reached for the handle, Clyde hissed, "You're opening a whole can of worms, Marvel." Marvel yanked the door open and said, "I hope so." Chapter 34. "This is a bit beneath you, isn't it, Chief Inspector?" "I'm not proud," said Marvel. "I'll talk to anyone, me." "Not me," said Richard Latham. "I'll wait for my solicitor, if you don't mind." Latham didn't look half as cocky without a toasted tea cake in front of him, but he was still putting on a good show in interview 3. "Suit yourself," said Marvel. But he sat down anyway and added, "Mrs. Granger didn't wait for her solicitor." "I'm sorry?" He'd heard him, but Marvel said it again anyway. "Mrs. Granger didn't wait for her solicitor." "I don't think I know a Mrs. Granger." "I'm sorry." "I don't—" Latham stopped, and Marvel grinned at him. Latham leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Marvel could barely hide his self-satisfaction. Then he decided he couldn't be bothered to. "I knew you were hiding something, Latham. Didn't I say so, Brady?" D.S. Brady nodded at the psychic. "He said you were hiding something." "Turns out it was nothing special after all. Nothing clever, nothing supernatural. Just common old garden theft." Marvel gave an exaggerated sigh. "Mrs. Granger is the lady who looked after all those dogs you pretended to find, Mr. Latham." "I don't know who you're talking about," said Latham, "so I'd prefer to wait for my solicitor before getting this matter cleared up. Thank you." "Of course," said Marvel. "It shouldn't take long once we get going. Mrs. Granger's given us chapter and verse." Latham pursed his lips. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the ceiling for a bit. Then he said, "Chapter and verse. That's an interesting turn of phrase." Marvel ignored the invitation to ask why. He sipped the tea he'd brought in with him and looked at his watch. 1 Corinthians, Latham went on, 15:26. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. "What's your point?" said Marvel. "Are you a religious man, Chief Inspector?" "No." "Ah," sighed Latham. "You will be one day. Everybody gets there in the end." Marvel snorted. "Are you a betting man?" "No." "Lucky for you," said Marvel. "I'd win." "Even as you lost," said Latham sadly. Marvel yawned. "How long did your solicitor say it'd be?" "About an hour." "From when?" "About an hour ago." "Good," said Marvel, and opened the case file. Marvel would have felt naked walking into an interview without a case file, so he'd hastily put one together on Mitzi Clyde, although it consisted of little more than a few photos and the recovered cheque, so it was necessarily thin. Latham laughed, but it sounded short and hollow in this small, featureless room. "I see you have lots of evidence against me, Mr. Marvel." Marvel liked the fact that Latham had been concerned enough to check, so he smiled back. "Enough is all I need," he said. And it was true. Cases could stand or fall on a single hair or a solitary thumbprint. Sometimes a box full of paperwork was only evidence of how confusing a case was, or how confused the investigating officer was. "So," said Marvel, "Mrs. Granger, Denise, are you two—" Marvel left the words hanging, but made a small twisty motion with 2 fingers. "Don't be distasteful, Mr. Marvel." "What?" said Marvel. "I thought you didn't know her. She could look like Julia Roberts for all you claim to know." Latham pushed his glasses up his nose and glanced at his watch. "So it was just a business relationship?" said Marvel. "I'm waiting for my solicitor," said Latham. "It was just about the money," mused Marvel. "That's very you, isn't it, Richard?" "I hope Mr. Proctor gets here soon," said Latham, looking at the door. "No offense, Chief Inspector, but you're a very boring man to be stuck in a small room with." They all stopped talking. Marvel finished his tea. Brady folded a page from his notebook into a paper plane and flew it into the clock. Latham sat. "Tell me about your church," Marvel said, to his own surprise. He hadn't known he was going to ask. Latham looked at him suspiciously. "I'm serious," said Marvel. "While we're waiting, might as well." Latham shrugged. "Well," he started, "it's small." "With a big roof," said Marvel. Latham looked at him like a headmaster. "Do you want to hear about it, Marvel, or do you just want to poke fun?" Marvel locked his lips and threw away the key. Brady laughed. Latham ignored them and went on. "We've only got about 50 members now, and only 20 or so come regularly." "What about when you were on TV?" "Ah, that was a different story. We had hundreds sometimes. Standing room only." "So what went wrong?" Latham shook his head. "You know what went wrong, Mr. Marvel." "You mean after you screwed up on Edie Evans, people realized you were a fake?" Brady laughed, but Latham's throat and ears started to go red, like some exotic lizard. "Everybody laughs," he said. "Everybody thinks it's a big joke. It's not a joke, Chief Inspector. It's a gift." "A gift you expect people to pay for?" Latham fixed Marvel with his one good eye, while his other kept a lookout. "Why not? People pay for rubbish they don't even need. Milkshakes and porn mags and Botox. Why shouldn't people pay for my gift? It's something I've worked at, something incredible, this skill, this magic." "I did pay for it, remember," said Marvel cheerfully. "But now I want a refund." Brady laughed again. But when Latham spoke next, there was an angry tremor in his voice. 100 years from now, you'll see. People like me will be paid our due. We'll be on the front page of every newspaper, received by presidents and kings. We'll live in stately homes like idiot footballers do now. Mansions and palaces, Marvel. Mansions and palaces. He slapped the table, making them both flinch, then jabbed his finger at their faces. People like you and you will look like the Flat Earth Society, while the psychics and the seers and the shut-eyes ruled the world. You'll see, Marvel.
In the future, we'll be heroes. In the future, we'll be gods." "Maybe," said Marvel with a dismissive shrug. "But until then, you can always make a few bob-nicking dogs." "Shut up!" snapped Latham. Marvel didn't shut up. Instead, he pressed his forefingers to his temples and gazed up at the strip lighting. "I can see Rover, Mrs. Jones, and I predict that he will be miraculously returned to you. I also predict that will happen very soon now, when I get sick of cleaning shit off the bedroom carpet. Don't give up hope, Mrs. Jones, and there'll be 50 quid for the church roof, please." "Shut your fucking mouth!" Brady and Marvel stopped laughing and stared at Richard Latham. The man was shaking with fury. His fists gripped the edges of the table so hard that his knuckles were white, and there was spittle on his lips. "You shut your fucking mouth!" Suddenly Marvel felt uneasy being this close to Latham. Even here, in the police station, with Colin Brady by his side, there was something off-kilter about the man that he'd never noticed before. Not just his eye, not just the marionette bounce. Something else. Something that made him want this to end. "All right," he said, "all right, let's all just calm." "Fuck you, Marvel. You think you're the only one who wanted to find Edie Evans? It was just another case to you. But it was my future on the line, my career, my whole reputation." Marvel looked at him coldly. "If your reputation depends on a lie, how much is it worth?" "It's not a lie!" Latham shoved his chair back hard as he got to his feet and leaned over the table. "It never was a lie." "Sit down, Mr. Latham," said Marvel coldly. And when he didn't, he and Brady got up too, exchanging wary glances. But Richard Latham didn't come at them. He leaned on the table, punching it with his knuckles and poking the air for emphasis. "I know things," said Latham. "I see things. I see you, and I see you. I see you both. Your wife is pregnant, and you're burning up in the ice and snow with all the questions and none of the answers." Marvel tutted. "Typical." "These things are true," shouted Latham. "These things are real. These things are not a lie. Oh, my God, my God!" He stopped suddenly to draw wheezing breath, leaning on his fists, red in the face. His glasses had slid so far down his nose they were held only by the fleshy tip. Then he slid slowly back into his chair. The silence pulsed off the walls of the little room, making its own pressure, which Marvel could feel like a heartbeat under his eyes. "If you were a shut-eye, you'd have told me where Edie Evans was. You'd have been able to tell me what had happened to her, at the very least. But you couldn't, and you still can't." Marvel looked at him coldly. "Because you're not psychic, Richard. You're not special. You're nothing but a liar and a fraud and a common thief." Latham started to say something, but his voice caught in his throat. He cleared it and tried again in a hoarse whisper. "I did find her." "No, you didn't." "Yes, I did," said Latham. The man spoke with none of his previous fire, and yet Marvel felt his ball shrink into his body in a primal response. Latham unclenched his fists and took off his glasses and sighed. He looked and sounded exhausted. He rubbed his red face and looked up into John Marvel's eyes. "I found her the very first time I looked for her. The very first time I was shown her photograph." "Where?" said Marvel. Latham looked at his hands and shook his head. Marvel leaned down and shouted in his face, "Where was she?" Richard Latham started to cry. "She was already dead." Chapter 35. For the first time since she'd been taken, Edie Evans was really scared that somebody might hurt her. She'd been woken by a strange, persistent, warbling noise, unlike anything she'd heard since her abduction, or before it. She'd sat up in bed and stared at Neil Armstrong on the back of the door. Neil wouldn't be scared. Neil would be calm. Edie tried to be calm, and it worked. A bit. Then the bolt on the door squeaked and she tensed up again as the warbling noise grew louder. The door squealed open and the alien came in, holding a wire lampshade and a plate of Mr. Kipling Bakewell tarts. Edie was confused by the lampshade. The light in the room wasn't the kind that needed a shade. It was a long strip of light right up high on the ceiling. This contraption was like a wok, with dozens of spokes fanning out from the middle and bent down sharply at the ends. There were electrical wires running from them, with multiple little knots and lumps in a complex and dangerous-looking web. "What's that?" she said warily, but he didn't answer her. Instead, he tried to put it on her head. Edie pushed it aside and scrambled off the bed. Her mind raced, and her heart beat so fast she could feel it against her T-shirt. She knew that aliens did experiments on humans when they took them off in spaceships. They drilled into their teeth and took away their babies and read their minds. They read their minds. Even as Edie had the thought, he came at her again, still making a high-pitched, wavering sound and raising the wire helmet over her head. "No!" This time she knocked it out of his hands and it fell to the floor with a clatter. The alien dropped the Bakewell tarts, and they rolled across the floor like little white wheels with cherry hubs. He bent to pick up the machine, holding his arms out to protect it from her. He stopped singing and shouted furiously in his alien language. Edie didn't care. She'd had enough. She wasn't going to let anybody read her mind. Her mind was hers, and it was private, and she was the only one who could say who was allowed in there. Not this stranger who'd given her a bicycle bell and some soft Ritz crackers, and now seemed to think that she owed him her thoughts. Her head was the only place she had to hide now, the only place where she could be the old Edie the way she was before, and she didn't want to share it. It was her mind. Edie pushed him aside and stomped on the wire thing. He shoved her away, but she was frightened and furious, and those two things gave her strength and courage. She pushed back and reached around him and kicked and stamped until the mind-reading machine was a useless mass of spikes and wires broken on the floor. The alien knelt to retrieve it, to save it, and Edie ran for the door. It opened on the room she'd been in before, with the dark ceiling and all the pipes. "Help me!" she shrieked. "Help me!" His arm snaked around her neck and dragged her back inside. He wasn't big, but it was scary to realize how much stronger he was than she could ever hope to be. The door slammed shut. He let her go, turned her round, and slapped her face. Edie stumbled backwards and sat down heavily on the bed, holding her cheek in shock, while the masked man that she could no longer pretend was an alien stood over her, shaking the wire mess in front of her, showing her what she had done. "You break my heart!" he shouted. "You break my heart!" Chapter 36. Ang Nu had left home by accident. 4 years earlier, at the age of 12, he had followed his third brother, Shua, out of their home in the dead of night, just to see where he was going. It was only when Shua spotted him a mile away that he'd found out his brother wasn't going back. A girl had rejected Shua's Ji gift, and everybody was laughing at his shame. Ang couldn't pretend it wasn't true. "Go home," Shua had told him angrily. So at first, Ang had kept following him, just to be annoying. But the first time they'd stopped to sleep, he'd discovered that Shua had taken his mother's story cloth and the spirit mask his father had given her for Ji. Ang had been shocked. Taking the story cloth was bad enough, but the ancestors resided in the spirit mask, and stealing it was sacrilege. "I'll sell them for food," Shua had boasted. "Then they'll be sorry." They had fought in the dirt, and Shua had beaten him soundly. "Go home!" he'd shouted again. But Ang knew he could never go home now. Who in Padang would believe that he wasn't a thief? He could never face the shame. And so Ang had kept an uneasy alliance with his brother through a journey of many months, through forests, across rivers, in cities, working when they could, going hungry when they couldn't, as they headed for their goal of England, where Shua claimed money was easy to come by. Over a year later, they arrived in Folkestone, balanced precariously on the axle of a flatbed lorry. They were cold and wet, but that was nothing new. What was new was the excited smile on Shua's face. The first time the lorry stopped at lights, Ang asked for something to eat. He was hungry, and Shua had the bagged rice and the chocolate. Shua took one hand off the chassis and reached into his shirt. The lorry started with a jerk, and Shua toppled backwards and disappeared. Ang didn't even have time to call his brother's name. The next time the lorry stopped, Ang slid from his hiding place and dropped onto the wet tarmac of a foreign land. Praying fervently to the ancestors, he walked all the way back to the docks. He never found Shua or even the chocolate. But it was not until 2 years later, when he was getting married, that Ang Nu felt truly alone. He was barely 15, but 2 of his brothers had been married, so he knew what to do. He had saved up the bride price. He had chosen his bride. He had given her a gift, and she had accepted it. He had followed her home. Then, as the Hmong tradition of Ji dictated, he had kidnapped her. Hmong girls understood Ji. They understood that they would be kidnapped and stay at the groom's home while his father and brothers negotiated a bride price with her parents. After 3 days, if they did not come to take her home, then the wedding would proceed, with singing and dancing and so much food that Ang still dreamed about it. Hmong girls understood Ji. Edie Evans apparently did not. On a dim January morning he had stopped Edie to tell her to get into the car, but instead of doing what he'd told her, she had pedaled away from him, as if she had forgotten all about the Mickey Mouse bell. Ang had been confused. His bride had accepted the gift. Now she must submit to the Ji, not run away. It was embarrassing, and he'd been flustered, and he had put his foot on the throttle and gone after her. But Mr. Knight's car was big and powerful, and Ang could barely see over the dashboard. He was only used to moving cars about on the forecourt, not driving on roads and going into second gear. He had hit her, not hard, but hard enough to knock her off her bicycle and onto the grassy area alongside the pavement. Ang had got out and manhandled the unconscious Edie into the passenger seat. Then he'd carried her bike to the bushes and thrown it away. The wheel was bent, and it was no good to anyone. The Mickey Mouse bell had fallen off. He looked about for it because it had cost him £4 and was a symbol of their love, the way the spirit mask had been his father's Ji gift to his mother. But he couldn't find it, and only looked briefly before losing his nerve and driving the car back to the garage with adrenaline throbbing through his veins and panic clouding his mind. For the first time since leaving Padang village on China's endless southwestern border, Ang Nu was truly lost. For the first time, he knew that he hadn't only left his home and the fields and his parents and brothers. He had left a world he understood
and which understood him. His bride had tried to escape the Xi. Whatever might happen next, would she reject him when she found out that he was completely without family? When she found out that he had no father to negotiate the bride price for him, no mother to prepare the feast, no uncles to perform the ceremony of welcome in her new home? In desperation, Ang had tried to explain Xi to James and Mikey, who were the closest thing he had to a family now. But his English was so bad that even he got confused. But although he was only a boy, Ang knew had not survived a journey through Da Te without a man's backbone. So he'd made another plan. He would have to be father, brother, uncle, and, when the wedding came, mother to himself. Maybe Edie wouldn't guess until after they were married that he was all alone in the world. And after they were married she would see that he was a hard worker and a good husband, and by then it wouldn't matter. So Ang had donned the spirit mask to perform the welcoming ceremony, fixing it atop his head and draping himself with a long black cloth in the way of the shaman. Then he had taken the bride price to Edie's home himself. He had put all the money he had saved, £100, in an envelope he'd found in Brian's desk. He'd posted it through the door before dawn, and run away before anyone could see his shame, that he did not have a family to negotiate for him. On the envelope, he'd let Edie's family know where she was, as was required. He wrote the details of where they could find her in his most ornate Hmong script, so they could see he had been to school and was worthy of their daughter. Now it was their turn to act. Edie's father must come and get his daughter within 3 days. If he did not, Edie was his. This was Hmong. While they'd both waited nervously, Ang had treated Edie with great respect. He had brought her food every day, and water in a heavy glass jug. Even crayons from the bottom of the skip behind the nursery school, with which she had started to decorate their home. That had made him happy. She was not Hmong, and yet she was making something like her own story cloth already. He had chosen well. His mother and father might never see her, but he hoped the ancestors would be proud. Edie's father never came for her, so Ang made a marriage hat. He used mechanics wire from the stockroom and copper wire from old flexes on toasters and microwaves he found in skips. Wire was very Hmong, and Ang and his brothers had always made their own toys. Now he put every bit of skill he had learned into the marriage hat. The frame was made of dozens of straight wires, twisted together at a central point, and fanning out evenly like bicycle spokes in a spectacular symmetrical round. Each wire turned down sharply at the end to make a stiff metal fringe. Once he was sure that the frame was firm, he started to decorate it with the copper wire. He remembered the toys of his childhood and recreated them in miniature from the fine, beautiful red wire. Each twist, each turn was lovingly wrought. Each loop of copper was a conduit for an array of meaningful symbols and intricate charms. Some were copied from the story cloth. Some remembered from his mother's own marriage hat, which had had pride of place on the only shelf in the hut they called a house. Other charms told his own story, his and Shua's, since leaving home. Little copper flying fishes, the bowl he had bought in the market, before they'd learned that a bowl just delayed food on its way to your mouth. The key to the garage, which gave Ang the freedom to come and go as he pleased, with nobody knowing or caring what he did, as long as he kept the garage and forecourt spotlessly clean. When Ang had finished the hat, he wished his father could see it. He wished his mother could. He was not a boastful boy, but the hat was the most beautiful thing he had ever held in his own 2 hands. Not every part of the Xi and wedding had been or could be so Hmong,
but the hat made up for all of it. 3 weeks after Edie stopped belonging to her father and became his property, Ang had washed his clothes and his hair and gone to the shop and bought brand-new cakes. They were the first food he'd paid for since coming to England, and each had white icing on top and a lucky red button in the middle. He'd rolled up the story cloth and tucked it into his waistband. It would become Edie's after that day. As would he. Then, Ang Nu had said a prayer to the ancestors, and had gone to claim his bride. Chapter 37. DCI Marvel had left his body. He watched Richard Latham's head cradled on his arms, and felt very far away from the thinning patch on top of the shiny pink scalp. 1,000,000 miles, 1,000,000,000, a light year from himself. He was a murder detective. They'd found blood at the scene. They'd always been looking for a body and a killer. And yet Marvel had never truly believed that Edie Evans was dead. He only admitted this to himself here, now, as he watched Richard Latham weep into the elbows of his jumper, with his spectacles on the table beside him. In Marvel's head, Edie had always been alive, and just waiting to be found. By him. "You're a liar," he heard himself choke. The coming bald patch twisted slowly from side to side in denial. "You don't know," said Marvel. "You can't know." Latham raised his head briefly and said, "I know." Then he put his head back down on his arms and gave a sigh so deep that it ended in a shiver. The hairs on Marvel's forearms prickled. He had seen 1,000 confessions, and most of them ended like this, with a cavernous sigh, as if the body was relieved to be finally rid of the burden the mind had forced it to bear. Marvel's own mind whirred with connections and possibilities. If he discounted the mystical, Richard Latham might have been a suspect all along. He'd known of Edie Evans through her mother, who had been to Bickley Spiritualist Church. His home was a bare mile from the Evanses' home. And most damning of all, Latham had lied to police during a murder investigation. At best, he had misled them by failing to disclose that Edie was already dead when he came onto the case. At worst, he had killed her. Marvel glanced at the recorder to make sure it was working. "What are you trying to tell me, Richard?" "Emoshimет." "What?" said Marvel impatiently. "You have to take your face out of your jumper." He did. "I know she's dead." "Who killed her?" said Marvel. He shook his head. "Nobody." Marvel frowned. "Was it an accident?" Latham hesitated. I don't think so. But I couldn't see." "So you know she's dead, but you won't say who killed her or how she died?" "I can't," he insisted. "Sounds pretty suspicious, doesn't it, Richard?" "I'm just telling you what I know." "Well, if you knew she was dead, and you had nothing to do with it, why didn't you just tell us at the time?" "How could I? How could I say so? How could I tell those poor people?" "That's bullshit. You didn't have to tell her family anything. You only had to tell us." Latham started to cry again. "But what if I was wrong? What if people stopped looking for her and I was wrong?" He shook his bowed head. "I couldn't tell anybody. I wasn't sure." "So instead, you were forced to take our money and string everybody along," said Marvel. "How convenient." "What else could I do?" said Latham, pushing his glasses up his damp nose. "It was already too late." He wiped his nose on his jumper and sniffed up what he'd missed. He looked at Marvel pleadingly, his cheeks shining. It nearly destroyed me, he said. Every day she haunts me. That's why I don't look for missing children. I could never go through that again. Of course, said Marvel. Poor you. That's not what I... Latham stopped and shook his head. Meant, he finished. That's not what I meant. Well, said Marvel, it's a good story. It's the truth, said Latham. Maybe it is, said Marvel. Maybe a jury would believe it. What do you mean? Maybe they'd only convict on the lesser charges, the obstruction of justice and the fraud. Panic started to creep across Latham's face. What do you mean, lesser charges? Maybe they would consider the case for murder too circumstantial. Murder? But that's not up to me. It's up to the CPS to decide on the charges. It's just my job to present them with the evidence. What evidence? Said Latham. There is no evidence. Well, there are close parallels, Richard. You have to admit. What parallels? Between nicking dogs and then finding them to boost your reputation as a so-called psychic, and kidnapping a child to do the same. What? Latham looked stunned. Then he started to cry again, harder this time. All that publicity, all that TV exposure, all that money. That's not what happened. Marvel shrugged. Maybe you didn't mean to hurt her. Maybe you were going to keep her for a bit and then return her. Just like with the dogs. Maybe something went wrong. No, cried Latham. Nothing went wrong. I didn't take her and I didn't hurt her. I'd never even heard her name before the police called and asked for my help. I didn't even know she was missing. His weeping now was unrestrained and noisy, with streamers of clear snot looping off his nose and chin. When I found her, it nearly destroyed me, he bawled. It nearly killed me. You don't understand what it's like. You're there. You feel what she feels. Never again. That's why I wouldn't help that woman with the picture of her son. He stopped talking and took off his glasses so he could wipe his eyes. Marvel sat back in his chair and watched Latham through narrowed eyes. Brady was shooting looks at him, but knew better than to interrupt him at a critical point, or at any point. Marvel made a face, as if he was finding it all very hard to believe. So what you're telling me, Richard, he said carefully, is that you kidnapping the dogs has nothing whatsoever to do with the kidnap and murder of Edie Evans. Nothing, said Latham fervently. Then his eager look faded as he realized what he'd done, and his lips turned down yet again. With grim pleasure, Marvel knew that if he played this right, he might get everything he wanted and needed out of Richard Latham. With the leverage of that one word, confession, he might solve the Edie Evans case and let Superintendent Clyde off the hook. A double whammy of promotion-worthy proportions. With perfect timing, the door of the interview room opened, and Dale Proctor strode in. He dropped his tatty old briefcase onto the table with a great puffing out of cheeks to indicate that he'd been moving heaven and earth to get there as fast as he could. "Say nothing," he barked at Latham. "Why is my client crying?" he demanded of Marvel. Marvel ignored him and leaned across the table to look deep into Latham's eye. "I might be able to get you a deal, Richard." "My client has done nothing wrong," declared Proctor. "So why would he make a deal?" But Latham glanced up. He reached forward slowly and picked up his glasses, then put them on so he could see Marvel properly. "What kind of deal?" "Hey!" said Proctor irritably. "We're not making deals. Dale Proctor is not in the deal-making business." Marvel looked at the lawyer. Your client just admitted his involvement in a plot to steal dogs and to extort money from their owners.
Proctor rounded on Latham.
Jesus, you didn't, did you?
Marvel went on.
And those owners include the wife of a senior Metropolitan Police officer. Nobody's supposed to speak to my client until I get here. That's what he kept saying, grinned Marvel. You can hear it on the tape if you wind it back, along with his confession to theft, fraud, deception, and extortion.
They both looked at Latham, whose ruddy, tearful face acknowledged that all of it was true.
Bollocks,
said Proctor. He slumped down into the chair next to Latham.
Sorry,
said Latham.
Hey, shrugged Proctor, it's your neck.
What about the deal? Said Latham. Proctor made a long-suffering face.
All right,
he said grumpily.
Let's hear it. I'm not promising anything. I need to tell you that right up front, but I might be able to make this dog thing go away.
Marvel spoke with caution. People never wanted something you were too keen to give them.
Yeah,
said Proctor.
Tell me more. Your client gives us complete cooperation on the Edie Evans case. Who's Edie Evans? Said Proctor. She's a 12-year-old girl who disappeared just over a year ago. Mr. Latham here was employed by us in his capacity as a psychic, but she was never found. Is my client a suspect in that case?
No, lied Marvel,
but he admits he's withholding information that might be vital.
Proctor exchanged a brief glance with Latham, who did not deny it.
And what would that cooperation involve? Not much. Just look at some pictures and use his gift. We have new information he hasn't worked with before. See if he can get anything from it that might be helpful to us. If he can't, he can't. But right now, he's not even prepared to try. That's all I ask, that he tries.
Shit, said Brady. Proctor laughed and nodded at him.
Even D.S. Brady thinks it sounds too good to be true. What's the catch? The only catch is, the deal's so bloody good the super might not go for it.
The super would bite his hand off up to the elbow. Marvel couldn't believe his own genius. It was the perfect solution. He would be able to offload the Mitzi Clyde millstone and reopen the Edie Evans case in one easy step. At best, Latham might incriminate himself while revisiting it. At the very least, he could shed valuable light on the one case that still had the power to keep John Marvel awake at night. Blinking up at the charcoal ceiling, while Debbie slept the sleep of the ignorant beside him, and Buster snored on his feet. Proctor turned to Latham and asked,
"What do you think?"
Latham shrugged. "I don't know." He was playing hard to get. Let him, thought Marvel. Let him play the innocent who wanted his day in court. They all knew different. But if Latham wanted to be dragged kicking and screaming to the deal by his lawyer to keep up the pretense, then let him. Marvel wanted Latham to suffer, but he wanted to know what had happened to Edie Evans more. It was as simple as that. He got up.
"How about I run this past the super so we know exactly where we stand? There's no point in me offering it if he's not going to go for it."
"Right," said Proctor. Marvel left the room. He walked to the machine and got a cup of soup and put 2 sugars in it. He stood there until the soup had gone cool. Then he dropped it into the bin marked "No Liquids" and went back to interview 3.
"Took some doing," he said, "but the deal's on the table."
Proctor, whom Marvel noticed was now noticeably red in the face, said tightly,
"My client has decided to decline your offer."
"What?" Marvel looked at Latham. Unlike his lawyer, he looked pale and sick. "I don't want to do it," he said.
The look that Marvel and Proctor exchanged was brief, but so transparent that they each knew in an instant what the other was thinking. Nobody would turn down that offer but a fool or a guilty man. Even Clyde got it. "Is he an idiot?" he asked Marvel as they sat in his greasy mint office an hour later. "He's being an idiot," said Marvel. "But no, sir, I don't think he is one." "Then he killed her," said Clyde firmly, "or knows who did." Marvel nodded. "That's my thinking, too. But we have no evidence against him. Only his own claims that she is dead, seen in psychic visions. And if he's willing to take the drop for the dog-napping thing rather than talk about it again, then where's our leverage?" Clyde sighed and shook his head with a pained expression on his face. "The CPS will never go for that. They'd laugh us out of court. Shit. What a bloody mess you've made of this, Marvel. You only wanted to get Latham for the dog thing because you couldn't get him on this other case. And now, when you try to cut him loose and make everything better, he won't be cut loose, because either he really did kill the girl, which he's never going to tell you, or because you've scared him so shitless that he thinks you're trying to fit him up for murder. Now he's screwed, and I'm screwed, and the only person who isn't screwed is you." But Marvel felt screwed. Screwed by whoever really had stolen Edie Evans and really had killed her, whether by accident or design. He had to try to salvage something from this mess. "I can go over Edie's file again, sir." "No," said Clyde. Marvel adjusted his sights in an instant. "In my spare time, it's still open. I could look at it right from the start, with Latham at the middle. Alibis and witness statements." "I said no." Marvel stopped talking and looked at Clyde's face. It was oddly patient, despite his angry words, as if he knew what was coming and it was worth waiting for. And suddenly Marvel knew too. His heart dropped into the pit of his queasy stomach as he realized what had happened. That Edie Evans had made a chink in him that was too big to fill or hide, and that he had spent so much of his life looking for weakness in others that he'd forgotten to disguise his own vulnerability. It was a mistake he would never make again, but he had made it now, and his boss was going to punish him for it. He understood the rules of the game. He'd just never thought they applied to him. "Please," he started, and then stopped and finished the rest of the sentence in his head. "Please, don't do this to her." If Superintendent Robert Clyde read those words in John Marvel's eyes, he ignored them. "I'm closing the Edie Evans case." Chapter 38. Edie stared at the door. Her wonky Neil Armstrong stared back at her. She had been sitting like this, not moving, cross-legged on her camp bed, for 3 hours, although she had no way of knowing that. Cross-legged in quivery stillness, her ears vibrating with the strain of listening for the man to return. She also had no way of knowing that it was now 18 hours since she had broken his hat, and he had stormed out and bolted the door behind him. In her dry mouth, it felt like more. Still he didn't come. Edie licked her lips, but her tongue was dry too. And bigger. It felt bigger than before. She got up slowly to check the jug again. Another dribble had collected in the bottom, but this time it was barely a few drops. The glass jug was heavy, but she held it tipped against her lips until her arms got tired. Swallowing was difficult. It was like there was a lump of cotton wool in her throat. She had to gulp 2 or 3 times just to feel her swallow was still working. Her legs ached. Even after she had stretched them, they ached. She stretched them again anyway and banged on the door. The sound was dead, like her shout had been that first time. She shouted again anyway. But now her mouth was so dry that the sound that came out was shockingly small, even in this shockingly small room. There were still 4 of the Bakewell tarts left. But although she was hungry again, she was wary of eating one. They cried out for a cup of tea. Tea? Her mother made good tea. Her mother made good everything. Edie's face tingled with approaching tears, and when they rose on her lower lids, she collected them on her finger and swallowed them greedily, painfully. But they brought no relief, only the faint taste of salt. She returned to the big glass jug and ran a finger around the inside walls. It came away shiny with moisture, and Edie licked it off again and again and again. How could she have forgotten the water on the sides of the jug? How could she have wasted it? All this time those few precious drops had been evaporating. She winced at a sudden cramp in her stomach. It went on and left her breathless. She lowered herself onto her bed and lay on her side with her knees drawn up. She waited it out. She waited for everything. For the door to open, for the man to return, for more water, for more water, more water. She waited so long that she fell asleep and dreamed of ice cubes clinking softly in a glass. The first sip was heaven. The liquid gushed over long, dry lips, like a flash flood across a cracked and dusty riverbed. The tongue fizzed in gratitude. The palate swelled in relief. The throat opened to welcome it home like the prodigal son. Before the mouth was even full, the rest of the body was tingling and alert to the onrushing paradise. Heaven on earth. Marvel put down the pint of bitter and felt that he had found his way home.